I know this might be taboo to talk about, but as a child, I watched The Cosby Show and dreamed of having a large family. To say the show had an impact on me would be an understatement. At one point, I thought I'd be an attorney like Claire. But to get back to the point of my story, even at an early age, I thought that my large family might consist of adopted and biological children. Well, here I was, older than I ever thought I would be, with no children. I explored many possibilities with no success, but the one I kept coming back to was becoming a foster parent. It was a world that, like most people, I knew very little about. So where did I start? Google, of course. I started to look for foster agencies, reviewed their websites, attended some information sessions, and decided on one. So what does a teacher do who's restless and contemplative in the middle of a pandemic? Get a puppy? Yes, I did do that. But more importantly, I opened my home to foster children. While most people were spending their time baking and eating bread, both of which I fully approve of, I became a foster parent. It started with the paperwork, multiple forms, including residential history, financial history, employment history, referrals, etc. Part of the process is to get fingerprinted and a medical evaluation. It felt like a deep, invasive dive into my personal life. But when you take into account the severity of a person taking care of someone else's child, it wasn't a big ask. In June of 2020, I started MAP classes. MAP is an acronym for Model Approach to Partnerships in Parenting. For those of us who have once thought that there should be a class that parents are required to take, there is for foster parents. These 8 3-hour classes are an overview of what you might come across as a foster parent, from the trauma of children dealing with separation to understanding the dynamic of the child's parents and their experiences. They're eye-opening and really help me realize that foster parenting is so much more than providing a home for a child. After completing the classes, I had my home study. This was essentially a walkthrough of my home to verify that it was an acceptable, safe place to raise a child. I was ready. I had the required window bars installed. I changed the batteries in the smoke detector. I dusted the moldings. I lifted the rugs and vacuumed underneath. I did everything short of alphabetizing my spices. Marie Kondo would have been proud of my thoroughness and organization. To my disappointment, the visit was all of 10 minutes. I expected closets and drawers to be rifled through, my refrigerator contents to be critiqued, and my overall privacy to be violated. Again, I was ready. If I'm going to be trusted with the care of someone else's child, there should be a search warrant level of scrutiny. Needless to say, I passed the step. The last step to opening my home was an evaluation over the phone. This was conducted by my foster care agency's home finder. Aside from all the paperwork, this felt the most thorough of the steps. I was asked about my philosophy of raising and disciplining a child, how I planned on balancing work and motherhood, my own upbringing, my interests. I was happy to answer all and any questions since this was the thoroughness I had been expecting all along. And then suddenly, I was officially a foster parent. Well, at least a potential foster parent. The agency needed a date for which I would open my home to children. It was early September 2020, and the DOE had decided that teachers would return to school for a few weeks before students. I was anticipating a messy school year and didn't think becoming a foster parent immediately was the best choice to make. So I gave them the date of October 1st. I figured that a month would give me and the DOE enough time to get our acts together. Well, I was wrong, at least about the DOE. The hybrid teaching model that we were moving into seemed like it would be challenging and exhausting. Alternating days of students in the building, some students at home learning on Zoom and other students in the classrooms sitting in the same seat all day, teachers moving throughout the building to their different classes, students passing classes with the bare minimum of work required. Really? How could I accept a child and deal with this chaos? My foster agency called again at the end of September to confirm my upcoming opening date. I told them I wasn't quite ready given the situation and I needed another month. Although I felt no pressure from them, I felt a great amount of guilt putting them off. Well, October came and school was manageable, but exhausting. They called again and I still didn't feel ready. I asked for another month. If I'm honest with myself, my delay wasn't all school related. The fear of the unknown and self-doubt had kicked in. But finally, when the agency called again at the end of November, my answer was yes, I'm ready. Expect the unexpected. Being officially open for children meant that every time the phone rang showing an unknown number, my heart leapt. Most of the time it was telemarketers, but then one day, December 5th, 2020 to be exact, I answered. And it was someone from the foster care agency. They wanted to know if I would take a 2-day-old baby. Keep in mind that the age range I'd given them was 1 to 4, because I felt it would be easier to have a child of daycare age and continue teaching. But the offer of a sweet newborn was tempting. It took all my rational thoughts to say no. In the following weeks, I said no to a 17-year-old. Yes, 17. An 8-day-old and a 4.5-year-old. There were varying reasons for the no. I couldn't imagine living with a 17-year-old, and I wasn't set up for a teenager. By the way, children can stay in the foster care system until 21. Another reason for the no's was that New York City schools had returned to completely remote, so I was adjusting for Zoom teaching again. Thanks, COVID. On the evening of Thursday, December 17th, 2020, I said yes. An almost 2-year-old boy needed a home, and I was going to provide one. I didn't get any information other than ACS would drop him off the next morning. Talk about mixed emotions: panic, excitement, fear, anxiousness, nauseousness, you name it, I felt it. I ordered some items from Amazon. I took off work on Friday, knowing that I wouldn't be able to focus and not knowing exactly when he would arrive. I went home and waited. At 10 a.m., I got a phone call from ACS saying they'd be leaving soon. I received a phone call from the agency checking in on his arrival. I could only tell him he hadn't arrived yet. I received a phone call from the caseworker from the agency saying that she'd be handling the case. It seemed my phone was ringing constantly for a child I hadn't even met yet. ACS called again, explaining the medication he'd be coming with. Wait, so they hadn't left yet? I waited some more. Around 4 p.m., ACS called again and said they were on their way. Little Jay arrived around 6 p.m. He was bundled in a winter coat, hat, and gloves, but I could see his pudgy cheeks and questioning eyes. The ACS worker handed him over to me as she was struggling with his duffel bag and paperwork. We went upstairs to my apartment since protocol required she visit and approve the space. Little Jay was timid, but brightened up the sight of August the pup. I gave her the quick tour, signed some documents, and suddenly found myself alone and responsible for a toddler. Not knowing what Jay had been through the last few days, my plan was dinner, bath, and bed. Well, sometime between dinner and bath, ACS called. There was a possibility that Jay was going back to his mother that night. I was stunned, but given that this was my first child, I didn't know what was normal or not. As I was giving Jay his bath, I received another call that they were on their way to pick him up. It was almost 8 p.m. So I put Jay in a pair of pajamas that ACS had packed for him, wrapped him back up in his coat, hat, and gloves. I brought him downstairs when they arrived and handed him back over to the ACS worker. Jay cried when he left my arms, but I think that was from being tired more than it was from leaving me. I went back upstairs, poured a glass of wine, sat on the couch, and tried to wrap my head around the day. Maybe an hour had gone by when my phone rang. They were bringing Jay back to me. I didn't get much information, but to keep his case confidential, I won't go into what I do know. I poured the rest of my wine down the sink and waited again. It was a long night for me and an even longer night for little Jay. He came back to me around 11:30 p.m. after being driven all over New York City, seeing his mother briefly, and enduring another physical health examination. He was visibly exhausted and dazed. I think he recognized me from earlier and clung to me. Still wearing the PJs I dressed him in earlier, I placed him in his crib. My hope is that he knew he was in a safe, loving home and felt comfortable enough to fall asleep for the night. But really, the poor guy just needed a minute of stillness to let sleep take over. Here's how foster parenting went. There was no daycare. It took a month for the city voucher, which is payment for the daycare, to be approved, and Jay's vaccination records couldn't be found. So I was home with Jay during remote teaching. After school was over for the day, there were a variety of plans. 3 days a week, I had to bring Jay to visitations with his parents. Visits were in downtown Brooklyn at the agency's office. Usually I'd drop Jay off and the caseworker was there to supervise. There was very minimal interaction with Jay's mom, but when there was, it was, well, awkward to say the least. I tried to understand her perspective. She didn't know how I treated her child when he was happy or upset. She didn't know what I was feeding her child. She didn't know if I was hugging her child and giving him the attention and love he needed. The great news is that Jay was happy and his personality was really starting to come out. He seemed more comfortable with me and August with each day. Eventually, the voucher did come through, but he wasn't medically approved to go to daycare. So the daily chaos became a routine that somehow we survived each day. However, the New York City DOE announced that schools would be reopening in March. I was going to have to go back to work in the building. What was I supposed to do with Jay? I reached out to Jay's caseworker and explained the now dire need for daycare. She assured me that she and the medical team were working on it. Well, 2 weeks before I had to go back into school, there was no progress. It got to the point where during one of Jay's visits, I pulled the caseworker aside, broke down in tears, and told her that Jay would have to find another home. She was comforting and understood that I didn't have much of a choice. She said she would speak to mom again and start looking for another home. This was a crushing decision. I had worked hard for Jay to feel safe and loved in my home, knowing that he had already been taken away from the world he knew and placed with a complete stranger. Well, long story, a little bit less long, Jay's voucher was finally approved. Jay was in daycare for a week and a half before he was reunified with his mom in March. It was sudden. Her visits had become extended and unsupervised, so there was talk of reunification, but it was unexpected. I received a phone call on a Friday afternoon asking if I could get Jay to the office because the court had approved an extended visit that would most likely lead to reunification. I had 3 hours to pack all of his stuff, log on for a Zoom medical release, and get downtown. The reality of what was happening didn't hit me. I was just going through the motions. I tearfully dropped Jay off and said my goodbye. He had no sense of what was going on and that he would most likely never see me again. The car ride home with no Jay babbling and singing the wheels on the bus was when it hit me. By the time I got home to August and realized it was just the two of us again, I was overwhelmed with sadness. The number one comment I get when I tell people I'm a foster parent, is something along the lines of, I could never take care of a child and then have to give it up. To me, this implies that I'm some kind of monster who has no feelings, who can just callously hand over children. Of course, I get attached to a child. You're supposed to. It's called parenting. What if I had said no to accepting Jay? What would my life have been like if I hadn't had the opportunity to be a small part of his life? What if they couldn't find a home for him? How long would he have been in the children's center waiting for a home? The result of not being a foster parent is that there is one less home for the nearly 8,000 children in care to be placed. When I submitted my proposal for this talk, it was about how being a foster parent pushed me into collaborating with my co-teachers. I was focused on the strength in numbers and teaching. Well, obviously my focus has shifted, but I do want to give you some numbers to think about. I want to encourage you to learn more about the foster care system. Even if you don't become a foster parent, as a teacher, you will or may have already interacted with a foster child. I'm going to leave these statistics up for 30 seconds for you to look at. Thank you for listening.